Hello everybody, thank you for joining our webinar on Art of Hacking, Introduction to Infrastructure. Thank you for your time. It's really, people have got a lot going on at the moment and obviously it's been a bit unusual time, so we appreciate you being with us. My name is Alan Pantling. I'm lucky enough to be in a great role, a part of a global team, and what we do is deliver what we consider world-class ethical hacking services and also training. Shortly, I'll be handing over to Pratik. He is one of our security consultants and one of our amazing black hat trainers. He's accredited pen tester, ethical hacker as well, so he knows his subject pretty well. If you don't mind, before we get started, however, I wanted just to take the opportunity to give a brief, a bit brief about what we are and who we do, what we do. Not So Secure is actually part of the Clarinet Cybersecurity, and we do two things mainly. We hack and we teach. When I say two things, hack and teach, there's quite a few services under that banner, which include pen testing, red teaming, as well as training, and a few other things like managed detection response, continuous security testing, and a few other consultancy services like software development, lifecycle, stuff like that. Got about, I don't know, 20 years experience in cybersecurity, so hopefully by now we know what we're doing. So we pretty much got some skills to do pretty much most things in cybersecurity. We've got about 70 consultants, so that's quite a good team. We're proud to call ourselves the largest hacker trainer for the world famous Black Hat events. Main one run in Vegas alongside DEF CON every August, and we normally train at that event alone, over 500 people. So it's a pretty big event for us, but obviously that turned to a virtual event last year, but probably again this year due to COVID-19. But we still get quite a good attendance even on a remote. On the training side of things, we also partner with a lot of other training organisations such as QA, Checkpoint, otherwise known as HackerPoint, just to name a couple of them. We deal with others as well. So getting onto the subject today, art of hacking. Art of hacking itself is one of our modules of quite a few modules we have in our portfolio, but this one's more about basic infrastructure hacking of all. So it's a few facts known about security on the rise, and as you know, even the biggest damage, if there's a crack in it, it can have disastrous effects. So, and security is a little bit like that, really. One penetration or one attack on you can have disastrous effects on your company. So you could say the old saying, prevention is better than cure. It does really apply when it comes to cybersecurity. So to give it a bit about today, today we're going to give you some flavors of some of the different attack scenarios, but I want to point out that this webinar is just to give you a flavor of it. It's not the full training course. It's an extract from the training course, which we developed probably 2-3 years ago, and it's been ongoing development. So we just also point out we've got some offers running following this training course from this webinar, and the promotions can, you can do things like get free pen testing, free training courses, that sort of stuff. So there will be a questionnaire at the end, so please complete that, because then that way we can follow through and maybe get you some free stuff. So if you don't mind, I'm going to hand you over to the man that knows what you're talking about now, Pratik, to cover the interesting part. Pratik, over to you.
Thank you, Alan. Hello, everyone. Let me just start with a quick introduction. My name is Pratik Shah, and I work at Not Secure as an associate director. I have around 9+ years of experience into an information security domain. If we talk about the accreditation which I hold, then I hold certificates like OSCP, ECSA, CCNA, CCNA Security, Novel Sentinel, Metasploit Pro Specialist. There are bits and pieces about my certifications. This is what I do for a living. Apart from this, I also like to contribute to an open source project. So I've written an exploit which has been accepted into a Metasploit framework. Then I like to do bug bounty in my free time. I also like to write technical blogs. So what I've done is I've given you the link of my blog. Cool. Now, before we proceed with the BIH webinar, let me just give you a quick walkthrough of our certification pathway. So if you are pretty much new about information security, so what we have done is we have created a foundation level certificate, which is Hacking 101. Depending on your interest, you can then choose if you want to go towards the web hacking or towards the infrastructure hacking. In our today's webinar, we are going to focus on the infrastructure hacking, basic infrastructure hacking part. If you are pretty much conversant with the basic stuff, then you can go for the advanced web and advanced infrastructure hacking. We also offer those trainings. Let me quickly cover the BIH course outline. As Alan has already stated, this is a beginner level course. So in this course, we are going to start with a pretty basic concept, and then we are going to drive towards an intermediate level where we are going to talk about how you can chain multiple exploit, how you can perform post exploitation, pivoting, and whatnot. The main objective of this training is to cover the basic concept, to give you an idea about what are the different attacks which can work on the network, and then what are the different tools which you can use to automate those attacks and to exploit those vulnerabilities. The best part of our training is to make sure that our delegates are getting a hands-on experience. What we do is we've created a vulnerable lab, and our lab basically simulates the real-time attack scenario. So you would find multiple real-time misconfigurations which are there on multiple servers which are part of our lab, and then you will be able to exploit those misconfigurations, and you'll be able to gain an access to the underlying operating system. Another interesting part about this training is we only give you an OpenVPN configuration. You just need to download an OpenVPN client and you are ready to access our lab. So it is like pretty easy access which we've provided to our lab. This is just a gist of our lab environment. This is how it looks. There are multiple servers which I have not shown you on this particular slide, but yeah, this is how our BIH lab would look like. You may be curious, like, why am I here? What can I get from this particular webinar or from this particular training? So if you are a penetration tester, you'll be able to understand how hacking methodology work, how to practice hacking on the real-time client engagement, how to exploit real-time vulnerabilities, and how to gain an access to the underlying operating system, or how to demonstrate the exact severity of that particular vulnerability to your clients. If you are a blue teamer, then you will be able to understand like how attacker work, what is an attack chaining kind of scenario, and how attack chaining can cause catastrophic events on your network. This and a lot more is accessible via our real life lab environment, which is being covered inside our basic infrastructure hacking course. Okay, with that, let's quickly start. Now, just to make sure that you understand this hacking methodology, what we've done is we've created this webinar on an hypothetical scenario. We are just going to assume that we have one of the clients who has basically given us a pen testing project. And the scope of that project is we need to demonstrate a real-time attack. We need to perform real-time attack on their network. Then we need to gain an highest possible privileges in their infrastructure, and then demonstrate them how we can access the sensitive data from their network and how we can retrieve that data. Now, most of the time, whenever we perform such pen tests on the client infrastructure, our clients, they do come back to us and they ask us a question like, how do you achieve the good coverage on our infra? To address that question, what we do is we just walk them through with this hacking methodology. Hacking methodology, or this cycle, is basically a cycle which divides your penetration testing in 5 different phases. So you have enumeration and information gathering. This is a phase 1. Whenever we are performing a penetration test, enumeration and information gathering is a crucial phase of your assessment. In this phase, you can either perform active enumeration or a passive enumeration, and you will try to gather the information about your client or about your victim. Depending on the information which you've gathered, then you will try to identify the vulnerabilities. Maybe it can be a server which has multiple ports open and exposed over the internet. You'll try to enumerate those services. You'll try to identify if there are any version specific vulnerabilities which are running on those services, and then you'll try to abuse those vulnerabilities or to exploit those vulnerabilities. So next phase, which I was talking about, is in identification of vulnerability and misconfiguration. In that phase, you are just trying to identify the misconfiguration, possible misconfiguration, or a possible vulnerability. Depending on your analysis, let's say you've identified a vulnerability, then the next phase will come into the picture. You'll try to exploit that vulnerability. Depending on the exploit which you've run, you may get an access to the underlying operating system. You may get an access to the sensitive information which is being stored on that particular server. And then once you have an access, then you will try to perform the post exploitation. You'll basically try to see if you can perform pivoting. You'll try to see if you can perform privilege escalation on that server. And to achieve that, you may need to use an available privileges. And once you have that available privileges in your hand, you can basically then perform enumeration and information gathering inside their client infra. And when you cover this cycle multiple times, at one point of time, you will realize now you have the highest possible privileges inside that client network. This is how this hacking methodology helps us to achieve a good coverage on the client infrastructure. Now let's talk about enumeration. And in this section, we are going to focus on port scanning. Basically, we are going to focus on an active enumeration. First protocol which I'm going to talk about is ARP. ARP stands for Address Resolution Protocol. Your LAN network does not function without an ARP. So you cannot disable ARP protocol in your IPv4 LAN network. It's a layer 2 protocol. ARP protocol is being used to map an IP address with an hardware or MAC address. So just to give you more clarity, what we have done is we've just performed a packet capture of ARP request. So this 21, row number 21 is an ARP request. It is a broadcast request, and to which we are getting a unicast response from that intended device. Next is TCP and UDP. These are like most common protocols which are being used for network communication. TCP stands for Transmission Control Protocol. It establishes reliable end-to-end communication channel. So when we say that TCP uses and establishes a reliable end-to-end communication channel, it basically uses a TCP three-way handshake to create that channel, and then after that, the data communication will happen between client and server. When we say that TCP establishes this three-way handshake, to achieve that, TCP packet has a component called flags. Each and every flag has its significant meaning when they go over the network. For an example, let's say if you have a packet which has an urgent flag at set, whenever that packet goes to the router will always give an highest priority to that particular packet. It will always be put at the beginning of the routing queue. So that is the significance of the flags in the TCP communication. Then the other communication which we talk about is UDP based communication, user datagram protocol. UDP is completely opposite to the TCP. It is an unreliable protocol. It does not provide any handshake. It works on fire and forget kind of concept. But because of this reason, UDP traffic is pretty much quick and pretty much fast. So your streaming, your live data transfer can only happen over UDP. So VoIP is a good example of UDP application, voice over IP address. Okay, now let's look into the TCP three-way handshake. Just to give you an idea, what I've done is I've basically performed a packet capture using Wireshark, and I've just demonstrated like how TCP handshake works. So if you look at the row number 148, this is actually a request which is going from, let's say, my laptop to notsecureapp.com. This request is basically reaching to the port 80 of notsecure.com. Now the first request, if we look at this info part, it has a SYN flag ad set. We can also confirm that by going into the flag section. And if you look at the SYN, you will see that there is a value 1 set against SYN flag, which is an indication that the SYN flag is set for this particular packet. To which the notsecure.com will just reply back with the SYN acknowledgement if that server is listening on port 80 and if it is an HTTP service. In that case, you will get the SYN acknowledgement. That is what I've shown you on row number 149. After that, once the SYN acknowledgement has been received by my laptop will send an acknowledgement packet. At this point, the three-way handshake will complete. Now, because we are following three steps, we call this particular handshake as a three-way handshake. Now, why it is important as per an attacker's perspective? For a TCP communication, three-way handshake is a pretty mandatory thing because it is implemented as a protocol standard, right? As an attacker, we can use this three-way handshake to perform a remote port scanning. So what we've done here is we are basically using this three-way handshake, TCP three-way handshake, to scan the remote services which are running on notsecureapp.com using tools like Nmap. Let's assume that this is an attacker laptop, this is a notsecure server, and we are trying to scan port 80 of notsecure.com. Our Nmap tool will first send a SYN packet on port 80 of notsecure.com. If the port is in open state, it will reply back with the SYN acknowledgement because the server will just assume that this laptop is trying to connect to my port 80. And then our Nmap server or our laptop will just send an acknowledgement, and immediately after that, it will just send a reset packet. Now, at this point, our tool has an idea that this port 80 of notsecure-app.com is in a listening mode because we've got a SYN acknowledgement packet from them. If the port is in a closed mode, whenever we send, let's say, port SYN-ACK packet on port 443, and if this server does not have port 443 in a running state, at a lower level, at a hardware level, it will always generate some kind of interrupt, some kind of error, which will be handled by the operating system, and then basically reply back with a reset packet. This is how the port scanning tool will be able to identify open and closed port of a remote machine. And here, if you look at the concept of this scanning, we are actually using this TCP handshake to identify the open and closed ports. Now, just to give you an idea, what we have done is we've recorded some demo around this port scanning. I'm just going to quickly show you that demo. Right now, I'm just logging into the Kali machine, which will be assigned to you whenever you log in, whenever you register for our BIH training, and you will get this dedicated machine. Just for this demo, we are only going to scan 3 different servers which are part of our BIH lab. I am going to explain this command in more detail at the end of this demo. But right now, just assume that we are basically using this Nmap tool and we are trying to scan 3.100, 3.180, and 17.16 server which are part of our network. And I'm going to write that scan result into a scan result file. Now let's try to analyze the scan result. So here, what I've done is we perform a complete port scan with the service version enumeration, and we basically focus on only top 1000 to 1024 ports of those servers. So we are only scanning the top 1024 ports of each and every server. So here we have identified 3306 services running on one of the IP 3.100. Then we have 443 service running on 3.180. And then we have identified port 445, running on one of our 17.16 server, and it is a Windows box. We've also enumerated the domain Blackbird. Okay, now let's trace back what we have understood till now. So what do we know? Once we perform this port scanning on the client infrastructure, we've identified an open ports on load service. We've enumerated the service versions which are there, which are running on those open ports, and we've also enumerated the operating systems. Now let's try to map this information and let's go into the misconfiguration, identification of misconfiguration, and identification of vulnerabilities. Here we are going to focus on MySQL. MySQL is one of the very popular database which is being widely used to host on multiple servers, and that is the reason this particular database is an attractive target for an attacker. By default, it listens on TCP port 3306. Typically, whenever we install a default MySQL server, it has a network access control list, which means that you can only connect to that MySQL server using a local host IP 127.0.0.5. However, in a real-time scenario, it may happen that that MySQL server is serving multiple different information to different web servers, which means that as a network admin, you have to disable that access control list, which can introduce some of the misconfiguration. And as an attacker, you can actually connect to that MySQL server. Now, when we are talking about attacking a MySQL server, what are the common vulnerabilities which you can come across? We can focus on MySQL version specific vulnerabilities. So there are remote authentication bypass vulnerabilities which were being identified in 2012. Then we can abuse the management console like phpMyAdmin, and then we can try to interact with the MySQL server. If as an attacker, if we are allowed to make a direct connection with the MySQL server, then what we can do is we can perform an online brute force attack against that MySQL server. Then there are vulnerabilities which you can conduct from the web application, like an SQL injection. And once you have identified an SQL injection, you can basically try to interact with the backend MySQL server. In our next demo, I'm going to show you how we can perform an online brute force attack against the MySQL server and how we can interact with that MySQL server. Let me just quickly log in. Here we are just going to use a simple grep command to filter down the exact information which we need from our Nmap scans. We've identified that MySQL server is running on 3.100. Let me just quickly run an Hydra tool against it. Now, Hydra is a toolkit which is very popular in terms of making an online brute force attack. So here what we are doing is we are using a default user, which is like a common user for MySQL server. And then we are passing a password list using -p command. As you can see, we've identified a password for root user. And now we are trying to make a connection to that MySQL server. Now, once we make a connection, from this point onwards, what we can do is we can first check the privileges of that particular user. And depending on the privileges, we can then try to perform different attacks. For an example, if we look here, we do have file privileges. This root user almost always have this particular privilege. So once you have a file privilege, what you can do is you can read arbitrary files from the underlying operating system. And that is what we have done here. We basically went ahead and we've just read a file /up/password from the underlying operating system. Okay. Now, if we just track back our progress, then what we've done so far is we've exploited a MySQL server. Then we've identified a default configuration on that particular server. We've just identified that the root is a valid user of that server. Then we've identified a weak password of that MySQL server. We've basically performed an online brute force attack. Then when we got an access to that MySQL server, we basically looked into the privileges, and then we've realized that this particular user has file privilege. And using those privileges, we've basically queried or we've basically read the file from the underlying operating system. And now we know what are the valid users which are present on the underlying operating system. Okay. Now, the next phase is exploitation. Now, in this section, we are going to focus on the Unix vulnerabilities. We're going to talk about what are the common vulnerabilities which you can identify on Unix and how we can exploit those. The vulnerability which we are going to discuss is Shellshock. Shellshock is actually a bug inside a parsing. So it's a parsing related bug. If as an attacker, if we have came across a Shellshock vulnerability, we can easily convert this vulnerability into a remote code execution. Now, Shellshock actually affects the services which uses bash to process the request. So you will see that we have Shellshock on SMTP servers, we have Shellshock on multiple web servers, because they are actually using some kind of services which are using the bash process. Bash is the underlying terminal of that operating system to perform some actions. Most commonly, you will see that the CGI scripts, they are a popular target of a Shellshock vulnerability. However, there is a condition to exploit a Shellshock vulnerability. Your bash version, your terminal version, which is less than 4.3, are only vulnerable to Shellshock vulnerability. And now to understand this Shellshock vulnerability, let's quickly go through this command. Here, what we are doing is we're basically using this environment variable command, and we are trying to set up an environment variable. So let's assume that we are trying to set up an environment variable X, and the definition of that variable X is from this single quote to this single quote. And immediately after that, we're passing a single command to the underlying terminal. Now, on a bash version which is less than 4.3, whenever that bash tries to parses this variable X value, at this point, bash will just assume that it is an end of definition for variable X. And everything after this will be considered as a command to the underlying bash or underlying terminal, which means now as an attacker, now we have a capability to run this vulnerable and this test both on the bash of that particular operating system. On a bash version which is greater than 4.3, that bash will be able to parse this complete definition as is, and that is the reason that particular bash version will not be vulnerable to Shellshock. And when we say that Shellshock is a parsing bug, that is what exactly we mean. This is actually a bug inside the parsing logic of that bash. Just to prove my point, what we've done is we've created a vulnerable machine inside our lab environment, and I've just ran the same command on that machine. So because this machine is vulnerable to Shellshock, you will see that we've got vulnerable and distress, both are printed back on the same terminal. This is just a local check. On the other hand, if we run the same command on our Kali, now because our Kali is running with the bash version 5.2, you will see that only this stress is printed because the bash version is able to parse this complete input properly. Now let's try to make things more interesting. Whenever we have a server which is, let's say, an outdated server, and that particular server is using bash which is less than 4.3, In such scenarios, we can easily go for the CGI endpoints which are exposed over that particular server, and we can abuse this particular misconfiguration to perform a remote code execution. That is what I've shown you in this command. So here we are using curl utility to interact with this endpoint, which is a CGI endpoint. Now this server is actually using an NGINX in the backend, and what we are doing here is we are defining a custom header, and in that custom header I'm passing that particular malicious input, and immediately after that we are basically passing a command bin/cat, exact path of cat binary, and then we are trying to read /ut/password file from 3.180. So if everything goes well, you will see that you will get an output of /ut/password from 3.180, which means now you have a capability to execute commands on the remote server. That is why we call it as a remote code execution. Now, what are the services which are affected to this particular vulnerability? So you have services which use CGI scripts like DHCP client, email servers, SSH servers, and many more. You can just look for the services which are exposing the CGI endpoints, and then you can basically play around with it to exploit the Shellshock vulnerability. Our next demo is on that same line. We are going to exploit a Shellshock vulnerability, and we are going to convert it into a remote code execution. We are going to get an interactive shell from the vulnerable server. Let me just connect to the Kali. Again, we are just using a simple grep command, and we are looking for this particular data inside our nmap results. Same curl command to demonstrate that we can read file from 192.168.3.180. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to start an NC listener in one of my screen session, and I'm going to listen on port 9999. Then we are just going to replace the command, and we are going to basically insert a simple one-liner reversal command to get a reverse shell from 3.180. So here, if you see, we are actually interacting with 3.180, and we are running with www data, and I can basically read the file like /ut/password. I can go into the present working directory. This is how you can convert Shellshock into a remote code execution. Okay, so in this section, we talked about Shellshock vulnerability. We've understood what is the logic behind the Shellshock vulnerability. Then we've looked into the manual exploitation technique. So there are tools which are available. You can use Metasploit, you can use multiple different scripts, which has the capability to automate this Shellshock exploitation for you. Now, once we've exploited this particular vulnerability, then we just went ahead and we've enumerated the system users. Then we have enumerated the network interfaces which are running on those operating systems. Okay. Now, the next section which we are going to talk about is the privilege escalation. And we are going to focus on the Windows operating system in this particular section. Now, when we talk about privilege escalation on a Windows machine, these are the very popular techniques which you can use to perform a privilege escalation. So there are kernel-related exploits, there are missing security patches-related exploits which you can use to get an highest privilege. Then you have an insecure service permission-related misconfiguration, uncoded service path, web folder or weak folder or file permissions. Then you can use DLL hijacking. Stored credentials are also a good option to perform a privilege escalation on a Windows machine. Then last but not least, UAC bypass or user account control bypass. Now let's talk about missing security patches. This is actually one of the very easy and quickest way to identify such vulnerabilities and to exploit such vulnerabilities. Now, if we talk about the manual approach, then what we can do is once we've compromised that Windows box, we can just run command like systeminfo. We can just use tools like WMIC to enumerate the patch level, enumerate the patches which are being installed on that particular Windows machine. If you want an automated approach, then what you can do is you can just go to Metasploit framework. You can basically use and post exploitation modules which are there in the Metasploit framework. You can go for enum_patches module, and it will basically highlight all the missing patches which are there on that particular machine. Metasploit also has a very interesting post module called local_exploit_suggester. What this does is it basically checks for the type of shell which you have on that machine. Then it checks for the architecture of that machine, OS of that machine, and once it gets all that data, it basically runs it against the complete post exploitation modules which are there in the Metasploit framework, and it will only give you the most possible modules or most applicable modules for the privilege escalation in that scenario, which you can use to perform a privilege escalation. Then the next is insecure service permission. Windows services, most of the time, they'll run with the system privilege, and system is the highest possible privileges on the Windows machine. Sometimes it do happen that the folder in which that service is running are being configured with the weak file permission. The registry keys are pretty much open. In that scenario, what you can do is you can basically replace that service binary with a malicious binary. You can just restart that service. You can just restart that machine to get the highest possible privileges on that box. This is again a manual approach. If you want an automated approach, then you can use tools like Metasploit framework, PowerUp, and PowerSploit to enumerate, and then depending on your enumeration, you can basically perform a privilege escalation. If we talk about Metasploit, then there is a module called service_permissions, which you can use to perform this kind of enumeration on that machine. UAC bypass. UAC stands for user account control. It is actually a security feature which was being introduced from Windows 7 onwards. So as per the logic behind an UAC, what it does is it basically restricts all the processes to run with the least possible privileges. Whenever you open a command prompt, it will always run with the least possible privilege until and unless you go to that command prompt, process command prompt.exe, right click, and then execute it with an admin privilege. Again, to bypass the UAC, you have multiple manual approaches. You can just use an inbuilt binaries auto-elevate kind of misconfiguration to perform like UAC bypass. Or you can just go for the Metasploit framework. There are multiple exploits which are available, which may rely on DLL hijacking kind of situation to perform this UAC bypass, and they can basically give you an access to the admin privilege or the system privilege on that machine. In this demo, we are just going to demonstrate this privilege escalation. What I've done is, because now the privilege escalation is a kind of post-exploitation technique, we've already got an access to one of the Windows machine, and we are just going to use that particular access to perform the privilege escalation on that box. So we already have an interactive session, and we are running with an RDP user, if you see. And this is a limited user. If I type a command like #dump, you will see that I don't have an appropriate privilege. I'm not able to dump the database, SAM database, or the SAM content. I'm going to use a post module which is available in the Metasploit. We are just going to look into the local exploit suggester. I'm just going to provide a session, current session number, and then I'm going to run this post exploitation module. You would see that it will highlight multiple applicable possible privilege escalation related exploits which are available in the Metasploit. I'm going to use one of the exploit MS14058 track pop-up menu. It is actually a null pointer dereference kind of module. It may allow us to get a system privilege. I'm just going to run this simple module against the compromised machine. I'm just configuring this module with the payload with the local IP, localhost IP of my Kali machine, and then the local port. Let's just exploit it. And now, if I do system info, you are seeing that we are running on Windows 7 box. The UID of our current privilege, the current privileges are system. Basically, we have performed a privilege escalation on this Windows machine. Okay. Now, what we've learned so far. So we know like what are the common misconfigurations which can be used by an attacker to perform a privilege escalation. We talked about missing security patches. We talked about the limitation of normal user. I've just demonstrated like with the normal user, we cannot perform actions like #dump. Then we've talked about Metasploit post exploitation modules. Okay, now let's go to the next section, post exploitation. Once we have an highest possible privileges on one of the network attached machine, what are the next things which we can do? And that is where this post exploitation will come into the picture. After gaining an access to the system at that particular machine, the next logical attack vector would be to go after the sensitive data, go after the passwords and hashes, then go after the SAM file, LSA secrets, then go after cache domain credentials, try to extract the clear text password which are being stored by user which are logged in locally or from remotely. Try to go after the web password. To do all these attacks, we do have multiple tools, like you can use Metasploit, you can use Mimikatz. There are multiple different binaries which are also available. What you can do is you can basically try to enumerate all this information, try to extract all this information. And once you have all this information, you can utilize this information to perform pivoting, to perform post exploitation, to even compromise another domain attached machine which are there in that network. Let's quickly talk about Windows credentials. This is just going to be an introductory of Windows credentials. Like, what are the common files? What are the most important files as per an attacker's perspective? All Windows machines, they do have a database called SAM database, which stands for Security Account Manager. Now, this file basically has a local user username, RID, and the NTLM hash of all the local users. So once you have an access to this particular file, if you're able to decrypt this file, you will get an access to all the local users' NTLM hashes. Then there are credentials like cache domain credentials. So these are the credentials which are being stored on your Windows machine in case your domain controller is not available. And if at that time, if you are trying to use your domain credentials, the cache domain credentials will come into the picture, and your system will basically authenticate you using this cache domain credential related verification. Then we do have credentials like local security authority. Then we have a very interesting process, which is very important as per an attacker's perspective, is LSAS process. So we're going to talk about it in our next demo. Let me just quickly show you how we can extract the SAM file and how we can extract the credentials from the LSAS process memory. Again, we're just going to utilize our previous access, the system level shell which we've got on one of the machine, and I'm going to demonstrate like how we can get access to the SAM file and how we can dump the plaintext credentials from the LSAS process memory. First thing first, let's go into the session. Right now, we are running with the system privilege on this particular box. Let me run a command #dump, and this is how your SAM file would look like. So once we decrypt the SAM file, this is how the content would look like. The next thing which I'm going to do is I'm going to extract the LSA secret from that machine. And for that, Metasploit has a post module. We just need to run that post module on an appropriate session, and you would see that once we run that LSA secret, it basically gives us a username and password of one of the service user. Next thing, we can go after the cache domain credentials, and it will basically give us an MS cache2 kind of hashes for cache domain credentials. We've got the MS cache2 hash for RDP user. Last but not least, I'm going to load a module called Mimikatz, and we are going to look for WDigest credentials. Then we are going to look for the credentials which are stored inside the LSAS memory, and you will see that now we've got a plaintext credentials for RDP user. This is how you can perform a post exploitation. However, in my last demo, we've just demonstrated that we've exploited all those vulnerabilities on a Windows 7 box. From January 2020, Microsoft has released that the Windows 7 has reached as end of life, and there will not be any security patches which will be deployed for, which will be released by Microsoft for Windows 7, which means that going forward, you are going to interact with the Windows 10 machine. Now, just to understand the difference between Windows 7 and Windows 10, what we have done is we've just highlighted a few of the security measures which are being deployed inside a Windows 10, which are being included inside a Windows 10. So Windows 10 by default, it comes up with a device guard, credential guard. Then it has an additional protection against an LSA. Then it has an in-memory detection, which we call it as an AMSI interface or AMSI API call. And then it comes up with the default antivirus. So if we talk about device guard in a quick way, in a summarization way, then it actually prevents a malicious code from running on that Windows 10 box. Application needs to prove themselves that they are trustworthy, and then only they'll be allowed to run that particular code on the Windows 10 machine. Likewise, credential guard, what it does is it uses a virtualization-based security, and it tries to isolate the secret so that only privileged software can access that location. Windows 10 again provides an additional protection against an LSAS process. So it basically prevents a code injection on that LSAS process. The best part of Windows 10 is it comes up with an in-memory detection. So there is an interface called anti-malware interface, which works with an antivirus to detect the malicious scripts which are getting executed from the memory of that Windows 10. It does not only detect, it actually prevents those scripts from execution. Then Windows, as I've said earlier, it comes up with a default antivirus, Windows Defender, and it has the capability to basically defend against pretty well-known attacks. Okay, does this mean that we cannot attack Windows 10? Answer to that question is no. Even after having all these security enhancements, security features, it is still possible for an attacker to exploit a Windows 10 machine. So you can just rely on zero-day exploit. You can just focus on missing security patches. You can just look into the common misconfiguration. You can look for multiple bypass techniques. You can look for local privilege escalation related issues. And then you can perform this kind of exploitation on a Windows 10 box. Okay, so after this, what have we learned and what do we know? So we've just talked about Windows post exploitation. We've looked into the different credentials which are there on the Windows machine. Then we've talked about how we can utilize Metasploit to extract those credentials. We've looked into the hash dump command. We've looked into the common privilege escalation techniques. Then we've looked into the post exploitation like LSA dump and the cache dump kind of post exploit which are there in the Metasploit framework. Then we've just talked about the security measures which are being introduced on the Windows 10 box, and we've just differentiated them with the Windows 7. I've just given you the demonstration of Windows 7 exploitation where we've extracted the plaintext credentials from the SAS memory. Okay, now these are just bits and pieces which we cover in the BIH course or BIH training. So if we talk about the complete syllabus, then what I've done is I've divided that syllabus in 2 slides. If we focus on the modules, as I've stated earlier, we are going to start with the pretty basic knowledge. So the first few modules are going to be pretty basic in the understanding nature. So we are going to start with the networking protocols. Then we are going to look into the concept of hacking methodology. We are going to talk about the practical scenarios, practical pen testing related exploitations which we've experienced in our career. Then we are going to talk about common enumeration techniques, like what is an active enumeration, what is passive enumeration. Then we are going to focus on port scanning. We are going to discuss about multiple different types of port scanning. We are going to talk about full connect scan, half connect scan, UDP scan, and whatnot. After that, we are going to focus on the different types of password attack. We are going to look into the online password attack. We are going to talk about different tools which you can use to perform these attacks. Then we are going to focus on the networking services. We are going to talk about what are the common misconfiguration which you can identify on the networking services. Then we do have a complete dedicated section on the Metasploit framework. Just to make sure that our delegate understand the importance of Metasploit framework and ease of use of Metasploit framework, what we do is we basically try to cover almost multiple labs through the Metasploit framework. We talk about the difference between manual exploitation. We talk about what is the strength of Metasploit framework, what is the limitation of Metasploit framework. Then we try to map all those concepts with an exploitation, real-time exploitation, like when to use Metasploit, when not to use Metasploit. And we basically try to give you a clear picture about what is the strength of this tool, what is the limitation of this tool, and how you can use this tool. After that, we focus on offline password cracking. We go through the cryptographic basics. We differentiate between hash and salted hash. We talk about how Windows stores the hashes, what is LM hash, what is anti-LM hash. We go into the offline brute force attack. We talk about different tools which can be used by an attacker to perform this offline brute force attack. Then we go into the operating system level. We first start with the Unix operating system. We look into the common vulnerabilities which we can identify on the Unix operating system. Common misconfiguration. We try to correlate these vulnerabilities and we try to demonstrate how we can perform privilege escalation on the Unix operating system. Then we do perform, we do go into multiple exercise, simulated exercise related scenarios. Then we focus on the application servers which are being deployed on the Unix machine. And then we try to exploit those application servers from the web endpoint, from the common misconfiguration endpoints. And then we focus on the CMS software. In this section, we talk about the manual exploitation way, then the automated way, what are the common CMS software, what are the common vulnerabilities which you can identify on the CMS software and whatnot. Then we focus on the Windows part. Just to give you an idea, what we've done is we've created a simulated domain join environment in our lab section, and it is completely focused on some of the common misconfiguration which you can identify on domain, some of the common misconfiguration which you can identify on the Windows machine. We again start with the enumeration. We try to stick to the hacking methodology. We start with an enumeration. We talk about how Windows reveals all this information, how as an attacker we can extract all this information, and we basically focus on the major concept called attack chaining, how we can chain these attacks. We also cover a very good concept, very good topic of PowerShell. We focus on this particular topic as per an attacker's perspective, like how you can enable yourself to use PowerShell in your pen test. We basically look into configuration related issues. Then we talk about the client-side attacks, like how you can do client-side attack, how to perform an exploitation on the client-side attack. We even touch upon the Electron JS-based application in the client-side attack module. Then again, we focus on privilege escalation. We talk about post exploitation, Metasploit post exploitation, and Windows privilege escalation related issues. After that, we go after the application servers which are deployed on Windows. We talk about like what is the common misconfiguration which you can identify when the application is being deployed on the Windows. We try to abuse that misconfiguration, we try to exploit that misconfiguration, and we try to gain an access to the underlying operating system. Now, once we have a system level access, again, we try to perform a post exploitation. In that section, we basically differentiate between Windows 7 and Windows 10. We go in depth about how Windows 7 used to work and what is being introduced inside Windows 10 to restrict that particular attack. Then we basically highlight the security features which are being introduced in Windows 10. Then we talk about what are the common bypass techniques which can allow you to bypass those security features. Like what are the different tools which you can use to bypass all these Windows 10 security features. Our last module will be focused on gaining a domain admin access on one of the domain which we have created inside our lab. We basically talk about Windows authentication concept. We demonstrate like how Windows authentication work, what are the common attacks which you can do on the Windows authentication, how you can perform pivoting on a domain joined machine. We basically try to demonstrate like how we can use Metasploit to do all these kind of attacks from that particular framework. So this was just of like what we cover in BIH course. With that, I'm actually going to hand it over back to Alan.
Thank you, Pratik. I hope everyone found that of interest, but you have to bear in mind is we only covered a small part of what one of the training courses, because bear in mind the training course on basic infrastructure hacking is normally 2 days in duration, and we just had what 40 minutes to try and give you a snippet of that. So I hope it will benefit to you. But like you can see on the screen, we do have a couple of courses coming up in September and October of this actual training course. In sooner than that, I think even next week we got our cloud course running, which is really popular. So if that one would be of interest, please let us know, because that course is actually going to be filling up pretty quickly right now. So yeah. Normally our training courses specialize in-house, so we do a lot of these courses purely for clients, but we now run them on a public basis. But if your team, for example, think, yeah, I can really get a benefit of this, we can run our special courses outside of the public one, just dedicated for your environment. Like you can see on the screen right now, we've got a whole load of courses running both US and UK time. You can get most of them off our website. Please log on the website and have a look. And also at the end of this, there'll be a questionnaire, and it's only 5 questions. Please complete it, because just by completing the questionnaire, first of all, it'll add you into a free draw to do a free place on a training course, but also give you an opportunity to chat to one of us about about how we can maybe help with other courses, how we can help the organisation. There's a whole raft of little special offers, so it's pretty worthwhile, just for the sake of a few little clicks here and there, you're getting in contact with us. So yeah, when we after this training course, after this webinar rather, we will be sending out the slides, so you haven't got to jot down all those things that are on the page just now. But what we are going to do now, we're going to head over to questions, because I imagine there's a few questions been put onto the chat page, which hopefully Pratik could be able to answer to your satisfaction. So over to you, Lizzie.
Hi, thank you, Alan, for that, and thank you, Pratik, for a really interesting presentation there. We have had actually a few questions in, which is really interesting. So if I just ask them now to you, Pratik, and hopefully we can get them answered for some people. So the first one I've had in is, does this workshop activity can be done on a VMware system? Sorry.
Sorry, can you please repeat the question?
Yeah, let me repeat.
Your voice
Sorry.
was breaking. Yeah.
Does this workshop activity, can it be done on a VMware system?
So the lab activity, or?
Yes, the lab activity. Sorry.
Okay, so you don't need to set up your own VM. What we have done is we've assigned a dedicated Kali machine for you. So what is required from your end is just install an OpenVPN client, download our OpenVPN config, and you are pretty much good to go. You just need OpenVPN credentials, which we'll be providing once you've registered, and then it's like a game mode. You can just access the Kali machine, which is dedicated for you throughout the lab, and we do provide like 30 days lab access.
Great, fab. Thank you, Pratik. Another question we've had in is, what operator system is required to repeat the workshop command instruction activity?
So the commands which I have shown in the demo, those are being executed on the Kali operating system, because we are using that particular operating system in our training, but that is not a limited option. You can just basically install those tools on Ubuntu and you can run the same command. That will also work.
Okay, great, thank you. Another one we've had into is what CVE exploits are used and versions of the target machines used as well.
Okay, so that is actually a tricky question. So when we talk about CVEs and exploit, those are they basically depends on the misconfiguration which you have identified. For an example, if we talk about Shellshock, it's like a pretty old vulnerability, right? But if you've identified a server which has not been upgraded because of some backward compatibility related issue, you can run that CVE against that server. But that will not be the case for a server which is like pretty much updated. Let's say you have a server which is updated till 2020. So it means that Shellshock will not work. Likewise, if we talk about Windows, if you have a server which is not been patched from let's say 2020, so now the recent Microsoft Exchange or recent vulnerabilities which are being discovered for Windows machine, all those CVEs will be applicable. Again, as a penetration tester, whenever we are deciding about the CVEs, we also need to look into the exploit. What is the end objective of that CVE? Like, how do we exploit that CVE? Is it an unauthenticated attack? It's an authenticated attack. What that particular exploit will do? Is it a denial of service attack? All those aspects will come into the picture, and depending on your decision, you may then need to choose that appropriate CVE. I hope that answers your question.
Great. And the last question we have had in at the moment is, how do you prepare for OSCP?
Okay, so I would say that go through hack the box, then try to focus on privilege escalation, because that is a tricky part. As per my expertise and as per my experience, I would say that the privilege escalation is like most tricky part of OSCP. Make sure that you enjoy their lab as per a learning. Do not take the burden of that exam. Just make sure that you enjoy that lab time. It's personally what I feel is OSCP lab is one of the best lab which I've just experienced throughout like my 9 to 10 years of experience, like in the information security. That is like a gold mine for a penetration tester. Just practice, talk about, like, look into the privilege escalation scenarios. Try to avoid Metasploit framework whenever it is possible, and then I think you are pretty much good for OSCP.
Great, thank you. Well, that is all the questions that we've had for today. So thank you so much, Pratik, for that, and thank you, Alan, for the great introduction and closing there. I just want to reiterate that we do have this offer for a free training place. You know, if you want to fill out the questionnaire at the end of this webinar, that would be great. And yeah, I hope you all have a lovely day wherever you are in the world, and thank you for coming to our webinar today. So thank you again, and see you all soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Hopefully. Thank you.
Thank you for attending. Bye bye.
Bye.